Hey, what's up guys? It's Christian with the Interactive Immersive HQ. I'm here today with a TouchDesigner and MediaPipe tutorial where we're going to feed in some hand tracking into a custom instancing setup. So let's get going. So getting started here, we're going to go to the MediaPipe TouchDesigner GitHub page and we're going to scroll down here. If you're interested in the project, there's tons of documentation about all the different components and different tracking models and whatnot. And feel free to check this out, read it, familiarize yourself with it. But our first step is going to go and click on this releases link right here. Scroll down. We can see some different notifications of that about recent developments for the project. But we're going to go down and then click on this releases.zip. So after we download it, we can go right inside and we'll see release, and we can double click on that. We can open these TouchDesigner files, and it's going to give us all the toxes kind of leading into each other. But I'm going to go ahead and just go into the tox directory and then pull out MediaPipe and put it into a fresh TouchDesigner project. It'll take a couple seconds. I'm going to go ahead and change my webcam to the one on my computer and turn off all the different models because it's just going to tank my computer's performance. But after a couple seconds, you should be able to see yourself in the tox, and we can go and play with the different models that are on offer. We have detect faces, which is giving me a couple control points of my face, facial landmarks, which is going to give me a mesh of all the different points on my face, and we can skin it. We can put different textures, models, and things like that, and play with it. Do essentially like AR filters and make some fun stuff with that. We can do detect hands, which we're going to use later on for our purposes. Should take a couple secs. There we go. And we have a couple control points. Detect poses as well. It's going to give me some control points of my body's different position. There we go. And so on and so forth. We've got detect objects, classify images, image embeddings. If you want to play around with these, feel free to dive in, learn as much as you can, play with it, make something cool. But getting into it, we're going to go ahead and do detect hands. And when we do it with this approach, we can kind of pick and choose whatever one we want to use. And so we want to go ahead and take hand tracking and pull it into our project. And you can see the different DAT outputs, and I want to look for the DAT that says hands right over here and pipe it into this right here. It's giving an error, just reload it, and then it should give us a top that's giving all the different control points for our hand over here. It'll do 2. So using this hand tracking tox, we have a couple different options of things we can play with. We can use the instance data. We can use helpers that's going to give us different values for hand velocity, pinch point, and so on. Then we can also check out some different gestures as well as the soft data that's coming through and building the actual texture of this hand over here. But for our purposes over here, we're going to take this top. And what we want to do with this is essentially use this top as a height map. And what that means is we have the background, and that's going to be 0, 0, 0, and it's not going to be influencing our grid setup. But these dot control points are going to be raising the grid of boxes that we eventually create out of the grid, out of the arrangement to kind of come at you and create that interactive effect. And how we're going to end up doing that is laying down a box top, and we're going to pipe that into a geometry and eventually a camera as well. And finally, a render. It's a very standard 3D rendering setup. And already we can see our box over here. We can even plant down a little PBR material and drag that into our geometry over here. It's not going to change anything because we haven't set down a light yet. So we can go ahead and put down environment light. And a very common practice is to put a constant that's just a white constant top, and we can drag that into our environment map. And it's just going to give us a little bit of a ambient light that lights up the scene just a bit. So there's a couple of different ways that we can create a grid A very common way is to do and lay down a grid SOP, and we can also change this into chop data and kind of instance it from here. Pipe this in. We can already get our sense of that. Here's a grid of different boxes. If we pull this one down, we can see our grid arrangement over here. But if we're going to use this top over here of our hand tracking, it's really convenient if we also use a top for our instancing, because we can just layer over this effect on top of our grid arrangement. And one way we can do that is putting down a GLSL top. And what we ultimately want to do is create a UV map. For anybody who's familiar with 3D rendering. So we write vec4 and vuv.st, and those are just our UV coordinates for our fragment shader, which is giving the positions of our, X and Y based on pixels and the height and width of the texture. And that's going to stand for our red data and our green data. But for our blue, we can leave that as 0. And our fourth value here, which is going to be our alpha channel, we can put in for 1. And as you can see, it's giving us this UV map right over here. We go into the Common tab. We eventually want to translate this into a grid arrangement where each of these pixels is going to stand in for one of the boxes in our grid arrangement. And so 256 by 256 pixels is a little bit too much for our setup. So we're going to put in 20 by 20. And if we click this viewer display and press D, we can go ahead and inspect the top over here. And we can see that from the bottom left, we're getting close to 0 values for the red and green. And then for the top right, we're getting almost 1 for red and green. And red is now close to 1 and green is close to 0 on the bottom right. And then green is close to 1 and red is close to 0 at the top left. And we can then take this and use this for our instancing setup instead. So we'll go ahead and put this into our translate op, put red here, green here, and blue over here. And as you can see, we're already getting our grid arrangement just like the grid SOP. However, this isn't centered at 0 now. So what we can do is fix that with our camera over here. And because we're getting values on our top over here from 0 to 1 in the X and Y axis, all we have to do is shift over our camera 0.5 and 0.5, and then we can bring in how close our camera is over here. And let's, for the sake of making it easier on ourselves, make it so that we have a square texture that we're rendering to. So we'll go back to the camera and then just zoom it in a little bit more. So now we have this grid arrangement of all of our different squares that we have. Let's put this into a null for good practice, and then comp over a background in the back. So our next step over here of integrating our height map over into our instancing setup, what we want to do is convert these white values into purely blue values, because this white is made up of 1 in red, green, and blue. But if we go ahead and add that into this, it's going to end up messing with the values for our grid, because we just want to modulate the values in the z-axis. So one easy way for us to manipulate that is we put down a math chop or math top after our null over here. We have access to our red, green, and blue values over here, and we can essentially just crush these values. And now, as you can see, these previously white dots now become blue dots. And we can then easily enough, we put down null over here and put down an add top over here. We put down this because it's important that the resolution of our top is 20 by 20, so that we're going to take the fixed layer of the first input rather than the second input. And then we also need to translate this over here, but we can already see that there's something going on when I wave my hand, that it's picking up some of this data, but the data is a little bit too extreme. And so if we go over and we take our math and we take the values from blue being 1 and we kind of put it down at 0.2, we see we're getting that effect as well. But the problem that we're finding is that these values then, these circles over here are a little bit too small actually. So if we go ahead and take this and insert a blur right afterwards and crank this guy up, we'll get more of a kind of dispersion, more of a fall off when I move my hands like this. The next step that we can do is essentially reduce the size of each of these little boxes. We make them 50 by 50. And then if we go ahead and make them even smaller, now we can see that my hand is coming through, and we can very clearly see the control points of my hand moving as we're moving our hands over here. But if we want full control of this, it's best to kind of do away with this top setup, because we don't really have very much control over what these circles look like and how they interact with our grid texture, because perhaps we want to make the circles a little bit bigger, in which case we're going to end up having to instance our own setup and use our own textures. And that we can do it by taking out this second chop out of the hand tracking tox and put that into a null. Then we put down a circle sop. Also put that into a geo. Put down a camera and a render as well. And we're going to get issues if we have multiple cameras and multiple renders up, because as you can see, this render is going to take this environment light and it's going to take this camera. But in fact, we want to use this camera over here. So we just go ahead and drag this over into the camera tab. And we want to only use this geo as well. And likewise, over here, we want to use this camera, which is already active, and this geo over here. So then we're not going to get any sort of crossfire between our different rendering setups. So if we go ahead and reduce the size of these radiuses, or this radius for now, make it even smaller, we're going to go ahead and use this geo, also have an instancing setup, and just pull in this hand tracking data. Z. And if I raise my hand, we see that it's not quite right. For one, because the camera is itself perspective, and we need to make it orthographic because we don't want to have any sort of change in the Z direction. We don't want to have any perspective distortion. But if we look closely at our instancing data, as I move my hand to the left side of the camera and to the right side, it's going from 0 to 1. So we have a camera that's centered at the 0, 0. We also want to make the ortho width 1 because that's going to be our full range. And we also need to move this over to 0.5 and 0.5. Now we're going to get a centered setup. We're going to plant down a constant material over here. That's just because we don't want to have to use any sort of lighting or any sort of realistic materials. And we're going to pipe down a ramp as well. We're essentially trying to do the same sort of setup as we had up here, where I'm putting this top into a blur, but I'm just going to put a ramp in the material itself. So we take the ramp, we're going to make it circular, and we want extend left hold, and we want extend right hold. And then we're going to go ahead and swap these. So we're going to go from full white to black over here. We're going to change black to actually white as well, but then hold down alpha. So now we're getting a fall off, and this is essentially going to be the fall off of influence for our height maps. And we can go ahead and drag this ramp into our texture. And you can see it's going from white to black actually, and that is not what we want. So we actually just need to turn on transparency on our texture. And we're going to put discard pixels on alpha as well. And so you can see we're getting a little bit of a fall off between these. There's a little bit of Z fighting between the textures, but that's okay. We essentially need to do the exact same thing that we had in our null over here. Copy and paste it. And put that into here as well. That way we can use this math over here and do the same sort of setup. But now there's a nicer fall off for my hand to move across this. And we have a lot more fine-grained control of how my hand tracking influences the texture that we have over here. Now, finally, our last step is to add some color and some post-processing effects. And if we want to color it in the same way that we've been displacing the Z values, we can use the same sort of height map that we've been using this entire time and pipe this into a null and then put this into a fit, because we need to match the resolution of this GLSL top, because we want to color each of our squares according to values over here. And that means that we have to use 50 by 50 over here. And one problem that I already can see is that we've got some clipping because the fit is set at fit best and we want it to be fill, just so the mapping is accurate. So then we take our geo, we drag our fit over here, and then we put our G and B. And as you can see, we've already gotten some coloring going where the background squares aren't colored at all. And the same thing that's distorting our Z is also distorting our color as well. And we can go ahead and kind of mess with these PBR values. I've set the metallic to 0.195. Kind of, if we have it fully at metallic, the texture is fully black. But if we put this down, we get a little bit of color, and then we can put on a bloom at the end of this. We get a little bit of a glow effect with my hands. And something cool, and it combines a couple different approaches, but in the end, we're using tops to control the full system, and staying in topland in this situation has its benefits because we can just kind of add the height map and not have to worry about transitioning into chops where perhaps our pixels and our boxes might not necessarily line up, but easily enough we get something cool that integrates motion tracking with one of the neater motion tracking tools in TouchDesigner. So hope you guys liked it, and see you around.
Hey folks, thanks for watching. If you like our YouTube content, I highly recommend you check out the Interactive and Immersive HQ Pro. The HQ Pro is the only comprehensive educational resource and community for immersive design, TouchDesigner, and creative tech pros. In the HQ Pro trainings, we cover almost any topic you can think of, and we go way more in depth than we do in our YouTube tutorials. We have a private group where Matthew Reagan, myself, and our other industry veteran and pioneer teachers answer your questions every single day. If that sounds cool, click the link in the description to learn more. And if you enjoyed this video, hit that like button and don't forget to subscribe for more free TouchDesigner and immersive content.